Welcome, guys, to another one of my videos. Welcome to Minko's bedroom or Minko's corner, I should say. That was my previous channel. Today we're back with Napoleon. Yesterday I did a little bit of a video on a very interesting banker in the Renaissance. You should go watch it, man. Come on, go watch it, guys. Leave a like. Today we're back with Napoleon, but we're back with what you guys want. Napoleon's Vietnam, going to Spain, guys. So what we saw last in Napoleon's videos was his win in Wagram, his revenge, and now we're going back to Spain. We'll see what happens. Well, that's a great quote to start a video.
In 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was at the height of his power. He had just won another crushing victory against Austria at Wagram and imposed a humiliating peace treaty. But the war he'd started in Spain and Portugal, with his ill-judged invasion the previous year, continued to rage. Napoleon had placed his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, uniting a proud country against him. His troops had dealt ruthlessly with popular uprisings, while routing a succession of Spanish armies. In February 1809, Marshal Lannes overcame the heroic defence of Zaragoza in a brutal siege that cost 54,000 Spanish lives and 10,000 French. But still, the Spanish and Portuguese remained defiant. And 3 months after their escape from Coruña, the British were back. In April, Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Lisbon to lead a small Anglo-Portuguese army. British redcoats would fight alongside Portuguese troops, who, with the help of British training, would soon prove themselves.
Doesn't British and Portugal has the longest standing alliance ever? They have like a 700-year-old alliance.
Highly
I think.
effective.
I'm pretty sure.
3 weeks after
Maybe I'm
arriving
exaggerating
in
on the
Portugal,
centuries, but it's a
Wellesley
long
moved
time.
against Marshal Soult's Second Corps, which had recently taken Porto. Soult and his troops, preoccupied with plundering the region, had no warning of the British advance, and were soon in headlong retreat, back through the mountains into Spain.
Spain is a country where small armies are defeated and large armies starve.
Having secured Portugal for the
It's a
time
great
being,
quote.
Wellesley planned a joint campaign with General Cuesta, commanding the Spanish army of Extremadura. On the 10th of July, the two commanders met at Casas de Miravete to discuss strategy. Relations between these two allies were not straightforward. Spain and Britain had a long history of conflict. The Spanish were deeply suspicious of British intentions in Spain, while the British had a low opinion of the Spanish army, which they considered poorly trained and badly led. Wellesley's request to take over command of Spanish forces was rejected, but the generals agreed to a joint advance up the Tagus Valley towards Madrid, to be supported by General Venegas, advancing from La Mancha. In the face of their advance, Marshal Victor's First Corps withdrew to Talavera, where he was joined by King Joseph and General Sebastiani's Fourth Corps. The French plan was for Joseph's army to defend Madrid, while Marshal Soult led 3 corps down from the north to get behind and trap the Anglo-Spanish forces. But Joseph, worried by Soult's slow progress and General Venegas's advance on Madrid, decided to attack at Talavera.
That's the broad of
This
the boy.
video is brought to you by our sponsor, Curiosity Stream, home of for sponsoring this video.
30,000 British troops.
The Battle of Talavera saw British infantry bear the brunt of the French assault. They
Did
stood
they win?
firm and repelled the enemy with disciplined musket fire and bayonet charges.
Yeah.
Talavera was a small battle compared to the great clashes fought that year in Austria. But it proved that under Wellesley, Britain's small, well-drilled army was a force to be reckoned with, even though in the short term, victory achieved little. Warned of Soult's approach from captured dispatches, the victorious Anglo-Spanish army retreated, while King Joseph and Fourth Corps marched against Venegas's army, which they smashed at the Battle of Almonacid. That autumn, the Supreme Junta in Seville, Free Spain's effective government, raised 2 new armies for another attempt to liberate Madrid, planning to converge on the capital from north and south. But Wellesley, ennobled as Viscount Wellington for his victory at Talavera, had been so disgusted by the lack of Spanish cooperation that summer that he refused to risk his army.
Yeah, she's like, you know what, bitch?
Predictably, Spain's inexperienced armies met with disaster. At Ocaña, they suffered their biggest defeat of the war, when a smaller force under Marshal Soult routed the Spanish army, taking 14,000 prisoners and 50 cannon.
Damn.
A week later, the army of the left was heavily defeated at Alba de Tormes. There was more bad news when Girona fell to the French after an epic 7-month siege.
Wow.
The Supreme Junta's plans to retake Madrid were in tatters, and southern Spain was now wide open to French attack. In January 1810, King Joseph marched south with an army of 60,000 men. Spanish resistance evaporated. Spain's Supreme Junta was overthrown in a coup, as
And the UK still hold Gibraltar to this day.
Cordova and Seville fell without a fight. Joseph, who still hoped to win over the Spanish with his progressive reforms, was welcomed by many as a savior from anarchy. Only Cadiz held out, its defences reinforced by a British naval squadron, and was besieged by Victor's First Corps. Meanwhile, Napoleon sent Marshal Massena to Spain with 65,000 reinforcements. He was reckoned one of Napoleon's best marshals, and had just been made Prince of Essling for his heroics in the recent war against Austria. Massena was to lead a third French invasion of Portugal, take Lisbon, and chase the British back into the sea.
Let me guess, not gonna work
He
out?
laid siege to Ciudad Rodrigo, a fortified city controlling one of the main routes into Portugal, which surrendered after 2 weeks' bombardment. Wellington, with only 33,000 men to face Massena's 50,000, retreated. Massena crossed the Portuguese frontier and besieged Almeida. After just 13 hours of bombardment, a lucky French shot hit the Portuguese magazine. 70 tons of gunpowder went up in a devastating explosion that made all further resistance useless.
Jesus Christ, it was like a nuke.
It was a serious blow to Wellington, who'd been relying on Almeida's
They
strong
nuked the
defences
city.
to buy
What
him
the
time.
fuck?
At Busaco, he found a strong defensive position and made a stand. Massena's uphill frontal attack failed, at a cost of 4,000 casualties. But the next day, the French found a way to outflank Wellington's position, and his retreat continued. As Massena's army neared Lisbon, his scouts reported something completely unexpected. Stretching across the Lisbon Peninsula, protecting the city from attack, they found a new chain of fortifications in 2 major lines. Known as the Lines of Torres Vedras, the British and Portuguese had been constructing these defences for more than a year. Now the lines bristled with more than 100 forts, redoubts and batteries, manned by 30,000 troops and 250 guns.
Oh, you can't take it.
Massena soon discovered the lines were far too strong for him to attack. What's more, a scorched earth strategy had stripped the surrounding countryside of anything that might help the French. While Portuguese partisans attacked French supply columns as they struggled through the mountains to reach Massena's army. Massena faced a grim predicament. Starved of supplies, too weak to attack, unwilling to retreat. But throughout this standoff, it was Portuguese peasants who suffered most of all. When their villages and farms were burned, many took refuge in Lisbon, where thousands died of starvation and disease.
Sucks for them, man. Sucks to be you, buddy. So, Prince of Islam, you're no longer Messina.
Back in France, Napoleon had been preoccupied with his divorce from the Empress Josephine, and then a new marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of the Emperor of Austria. She was now expecting their first child.
That's one way to make an alliance.
Nevertheless, from Paris, Napoleon sent frequent orders to his marshals in Spain and Portugal, urging them to take more aggressive action. But when these orders arrived weeks later, they were usually out of date and showed little understanding of the problems his marshals faced. He now ordered Soult, based in Andalusia, to go on the offensive to draw enemy forces away from Lisbon, so Massena could take the city. Soult laid siege to Badajoz, a fortified city that controlled the southern route into Portugal. When 12,000 men of the army of Extremadura marched to its relief, they were routed by Soult, after which the city tamely surrendered, giving up 8,000 prisoners and vast quantities of stores. It was another heavy blow to Spain's armed forces.
And
but remarkably, despite...
What's the most interesting is that Spain hasn't surrendered yet. I would have.
Such
so many losses they go through.
Many blundering generals,
20 armies by now.
The Spanish troops remained willing to fight. The courage of the rank and file undimmed.
It's insane.
Victor's First Corps, besieging Cadiz, had now been so weakened to support other operations that the Anglo-Spanish garrison decided to attack. The Allies landed along the coast to strike at the French siege lines from the rear. But they were ambushed by the French at Barossa. Despite heavy losses, the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard fought off the enemy, but a furious falling out between British commander Sir Thomas Graham and his Spanish counterpart General La Peña threw away any advantage. Soult, alarmed at these developments, marched back to Andalusia. Meanwhile, Massena, out of food and with no prospect of reinforcement, had no option but to retreat.
He was bouncing, he's like, I'm out.
Wellington's army pursued, discovering evidence of several appalling atrocities committed by the French against Portuguese villagers.
Sucks to be you.
There were running battles with the French rearguard, brilliantly commanded by Marshal Ney, until he was sacked by Massena for criticizing his leadership. Having chased the French out of Portugal, Wellington besieged Almeida.
Okay, we need Davout, guys.
Massena's army, now
Davout.
rested and reinforced, marched to its aid. The two armies clashed again at Fuentes de Oñoro. In 2 days of heavy fighting, Massena failed to break through Wellington's position to relieve Almeida. The fortress fell the next week, but to Wellington's fury, British bungling allowed most of the French garrison to escape.
I'm sorry for this.
Massena had lost 25,000 men in Portugal. Now he'd lost Almeida too, and a string of bad decisions, not least to bring his mistress with him on campaign, had cost him the respect of his officers. The Marshal, whom Napoleon had once nicknamed the Dear Child of Victory, was recalled to France in disgrace, never to hold senior command again. Napoleon sent Marshal Marmont to replace him. Meanwhile,
I mean, it's pretty insane when you think about it. That the guy brought his mistress. Are you kidding me?
Marshal Beresford, the British commander of Portugal's army, was sent to retake Badajoz with 20,000 British and Portuguese troops. When Soult approached with a relief force, Beresford marched to meet him at Albuera. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Around 6,000 casualties on each side, with more than a third of the British infantry killed, wounded or captured. Marshal Soult declared,
"There is no beating these troops, in spite of their generals.
Why'd you do that?
I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now I'm sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine.
Get the
But
fuck
they
out.
didn't know how to run."
Soult had been
What?
checked, but he was determined to save Badajoz. The newly arrived Marshal Marmont marched to his aid, and they advanced again.
Why did you do that?
This
That's so funny.
combined army forced the British to abandon the siege.
That's hilarious.
But when Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position across the Portuguese border, Soult and Marmont did not pursue. French commanders in Spain had learned grudging respect for Wellington and for the steadiness of his troops. For now, the war in Spain had entered stalemate.
They had graffitis back then?
While British, French and Spanish armies crisscrossed Spain and Portugal, another war was fought every day in the mountains, hills and woods. From 1808, Spanish and Portuguese civilians, militias and ex-soldiers began taking up arms against the hated French invader. They waged a war of ambushes and hit-and-run raids, known in Spanish as La Guerrilla, the Little War. Its fighters became known in English as guerrillas.
Yeah.
Britain's
I was wondering
Royal
where
Navy
that
supplied
term
vital
came
weapons, stores and money, often landing them behind enemy lines. Much of Spain's rugged countryside fell under the control of the guerrillas. North of Madrid, Juan Martín Díez, an ex-soldier known as El Empecinado, the Stubborn, led a guerrilla band 6,000 strong. In Navarre, Esposimina, a former peasant, ran a highly organized band that caused havoc for the French, capturing convoys and couriers on the strategic Burgos-Bayonne road, and branding Viva Mina on the forehead of collaborators. While in the west, Julian Sanchez, known as El Charro, led the self-styled Lanceros de Castilla. El Charro himself wore a French hussar's cap, its eagle symbolically turned upside down. There were dozens more bands operating across Spain, though a few were no better than bandits, terrorizing civilians as often as the enemy. The guerrilla war was merciless, marked by hideous atrocities on both sides. A French soldier's greatest fear was to be taken alive by the guerrillas, who often tortured their prisoners before killing them. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down by this people's war, guarding outposts or patrolling the countryside. The roads were so dangerous for French messengers that they required cavalry escorts of 200 men or more. Many still didn't get through, their valuable dispatches forwarded to Wellington, for whom they became an invaluable source of intelligence. The war in Spain would ultimately cost the lives of 240,000 French soldiers.
Jesus Christ.
As was typical in wars of this era, most died from disease,
Yeah,
but more died fighting guerrillas than in battle against the British and Spanish armies.
Wow.
However, it was the twin threat, a well-led regular army under Wellington and a popular insurgency, that left
So
the French facing an impossible strategic
did the
dilemma.
French
If their
overrun
armies
them,
remained
or
dispersed to fight the guerrillas, Wellington could attack. But if they concentrated to defeat Wellington in battle, huge swathes of the country would quickly fall to the guerrillas.
double-edged
This
sword?
was
The fuck?
Napoleon's Vietnam, or his bleeding ulcer, as he called it. A war that cost his empire an average of 100 casualties every day, with little prospect of victory.
At the same time,
And in 1812, as Napoleon launched his gigantic invasion of Russia,
what the fuck are you
Wellington
thinking?
and the guerrillas launched their own offensive that would turn the war in Spain on its head.
Well, that was idiotic.
Thank you to all.
I could never understand that. Why go to Russia, man? Why? They're your ally. Even if you win, what are you gonna do? You're gonna take over territory? No. You might give territory to other states, create more client states, but you're gonna put your other brother that you've hidden somewhere as the emperor. I mean, I don't know. I never understood that. Like the Spain thing, it's on your border. Maybe get territory, install your brother as king. Okay, but the Russia thing, that I could never get. That I could never get. I mean, incredible video again, Epic History TV. But I mean, next video we're gonna see what happens in Spain, and then we're gonna go to the Russian campaign. But this is something I never understood from Napoleon. Why go to Russia? Like, I mean, I guess we'll see, when the videos about Russia come along. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.